So, good evening everyone, and welcome to tonight's episode. This is Snapshots from the Road to Russian, and although you may see a quite small amount of stages presented at the bottom here, I have the feeling that this might go on for a little bit longer than usual. Good evening, Pig, and of course everyone else. Welcome. So, let's start with the trees and maps again. We are certainly all familiar with all of these. This is perhaps the last episode of a Northwest Indo-European language. And the map will be familiar to us as well, although this time we will be talking about a Balto-Slavic language. Something a little bit new for us. So, let's start with the classic, the voiced aspirated stops of Proto-Indo-European. So we go from b to b. For example, they simply lose their aspiration. For brother, we go from breter to bratte. The question mark looking thing here is a glottal stop. So This might be difficult to conceptualize if you're not familiar with a language that uses this sound. Some British English variants use it. And in those cases, it is usually where you would expect a T, such as the stereotypical British. That's a glottal stop. And then medu simply becomes medu, and gens becomes gansis. And often a lot of word final consonants eventually become lost. First, all nasal consonants at the end of words become alveolar nasals, so an M becomes an N, for example, and then all alveolar consonants are lost. This is mostly made up of alveolar nasal consonants, because Proto-Indo-European had fairly few word final stop consonants. There are some with a T or a D, but I couldn't think of an example for this. So, our example is grain. This is the first time that we will pay any attention to a consonant with a point on top of it. I think the next slide will be the one where I explain that one. Just ignore it for now. So, grain in Proto-Indo-European was grechnom, and this becomes zirna in Balto-Slavic. Yes, indeed. This is the slide where I explain the points. So, you might have heard about satemization, or perhaps a divide in the Indo-European languages into Kentum and Satem languages. Traditionally, this was seen as the first split between an eastern and western branch of the language family, although in the time since it has turned out that's probably not the case. But let's get to that a bit later. What is important to understand this process is that Proto-Indo-European had three different kinds of dorsal stops. Dorsal stops are stop consonants that you make with the back of the tongue, so dorsum. We have the normal velar ones, like k, k. Then we have the labialized velar consonants. These are called labiovelar in the Proto-Indo-European research tradition. It's a bit weird as a name, but that's what's usual. So these are w, like quis, for example, who in Latin. And then there are the ones with the point on top of them. These are palatovelar, so they are, honestly, I'd rather call them palatal stops, but the thing with the palate, so the front part of the roof of the mouth, is that you can either make coronal stops there, so using your the tip of your tongue. These are called retroflex stops. So for example, you can make a or you can use the dorsum and you can make it ke, ke. If you remember the episode about Irish, the IPA symbols here might be familiar to you, as Irish has developed these kinds of dorsal palatal stops later in its history. And these kinds of sounds are also found in some other languages, such as Low German. In both Irish and Low German, they have developed from palatalized velar stops. So going from ye to ke. In all the languages that we have talked about until now, the velar and palatovelar consonants merged quite early, so they don't really enter into any of the histories of the modern languages. However, in the case of Balto-Slavic, it was the velar and labiovelar that have merged into plain velars. So for example, again, quis, who in Proto-Indo-European and almost identical in Latin becomes kas. So the w is lost. It just becomes a k. And the palatovelars that in all the other languages we've talked about just become normal velars, become assimilated. That means that they become S-like. So sibilants are the type of sound that includes S, Z, J, and that kind of thing. Hello, Robert Brown. You are not too late. And this is the first slide. Here I have a couple of examples for this assimilation. Here you might notice hec was, horse. If you are only familiar with Latin, you might think this was in fact a labiovelar, as it becomes that in Latin. But in Proto-Indo-European, these were separate consonants in separate syllables. So because of this, the Balto-Slavic for mare, in this case, is the only variant that survives. A female horse is eshva. You see that the K turns into an S. Then we have the classical index word for the Kentum and Satem languages, 100. So this was kmtom in Proto-Indo-European with a syllabic consonant here. So instead of a vowel, the M, this nasal consonant, is used in the role that a vowel usually takes. And this becomes Simta in Balto-Slavic. It becomes Satem in Avestan, the liturgical language of ancient Persia. And that is where the name for the Satem languages comes from. And again, we have the same word from the last slide. Grain, grechnom, becomes jirna. Because this g is voiced, of course, the sibilant that it reflexes into is also voiced. So instead of an s, it is a z. Another major development at this stage is the so-called Roki law. Unlike most of the other laws that we talk about, this is not named after someone called Roki, and instead it is descriptive of the process. In this process, a normal S becomes hushed, like in ship, when it comes after a trill. This is the R, a velar stop, so K, G, G, and any of the semivowels found in Proto-Indo-European or their vowel allophones. So we can build up a Ru-Ki out of these contexts as an abbreviation of the various environments in which this process happens. Here we have an example. This is Heusrech. Here we have an S after a W, so this triggers this process, and this becomes Aushra. The Roman or Latin word aurora also comes from this same origin. Many of these S's in this kind of positions become R's in Latin. So, then let's have a map of the Kentum and Satem languages. Here we have the model of the spread of the major Indo-European branches that I myself ascribe to, and the so-called Kentum languages, in which the K in Kmtom survives as a K, at least initially, are marked in blue, and the ones where it satemizes have been marked in hot pink. So, the reason that this is clearly not the first split in the Indo-European language family is that the Anatolian languages and the Tocharian languages, which were the first to split from the main group, do not show this process. But it might be a later major split. And in this case, my conventional mapping of these developments would of course be false. However, the thing is that the Satem process has gone through a sort of its perfect form in the Aryan languages, at that time spoken in Ukraine and spreading into Central Asia and the Middle East, and eventually into Persia and India. And some of the other languages in which this process has taken place, it isn't entire, it isn't the whole process. It's like a Xerox, an imperfect copy of the original process. And this is an argument for the satemization process to have originally happened in the Aryan languages, and that it would have spread as an aerial effect. So speakers of the early Balto-Slavic languages being in constant contact with speakers of the Aryan languages, it would have spread from the Aryan languages into the Balto-Slavic languages. And this would have been the case for the other branches as well. Thracian here, Thracian probably in English, seems to have been an extremely closely related language to Greek, but Greek of course doesn't satemize. So it may have well been the aerial effect along the coast of the Black Sea that causes this. And as well for Armenian itself in this model, also relatively closely related with Greek. On the other hand, it might be the other way around for the southern branch. The southern branch would have conceivably begun a satemization process before splitting off from the main group, and Greek might have had a restoration of the K value from some other, perhaps from one of the smaller branches around here, or perhaps from the Anatolian languages, although I find this much less convincing. So now we have to make quite a jump in time to the Slavic languages. There are three major groups to the Balto-Slavic family. They are the West Baltic languages, which are now extinct. The most famous of these is the Old Prussian language, which became extinct in the Middle Ages, as many of you may be familiar with the German Prussians. There was a German-led crusade into the Baltics, and Prussia became entirely assimilated by the Germans. Some of the East Baltic languages survive, mainly Latvian and Lithuanian, although there have been many more, as we will see on the map. And then Slavic as a third major branch. Some of the more adventurous individuals even sometimes call this South Baltic to underline its position as a same level branch as West and East Baltic. So then looking at the map, we have the Western Baltic areas here. This is Prussia. If you look at the political map of the 19th century and look at the Kingdom of Prussia, it will basically be all of this. The Eastern Baltic family here is spread further east than it does today. Today it mostly survives here and has spread a little bit further north than I believe it spread in prehistory. Much of this more eastern area is now occupied by Slavic languages. And then our interest, the Slavic languages, appear to have been the southernmost area of the Balto-Slavic group. This might actually be how the Slavic languages came to have such an explosive spread in the early Middle Ages. But let's get back to that later. Let's talk about the common developments of the Slavic languages. There are actually a lot of these. The Eastern Baltic languages are quite conservative. Lithuanian in particular is a classic example of a language that you might have almost understood if you spoke Latin. Question: has Old Prussian influenced German Prussians at all? This is unfortunately something that I don't know. The Old Prussians were extremely socially discriminated against, so the German Prussians would have made their best effort not to be influenced by them. But what actually happened, I don't know. The Prussians were extensively enslaved at the beginning of the Crusade. And this is actually a part of the reason that the Germans did not make huge efforts trying to spread Christianity in the Baltics, despite being present officially on a crusade. And this was because it was illegal for Christians to have Christians as slaves. So if they didn't convert the Prussians, they could keep holding them as slaves. So, getting back to the Slavic branch, there's a large process of losing syllable codas, so the final elements, the elements that come after the vowel. Simple word final consonants are just lost. For example, here we have the Balto-Slavic for sleep, supnas. The S at the end is simply disappears. And this consonant cluster in this word, the first syllable originally had a P, and the second syllable an N at the beginning. This simply simplifies, so that the early Slavic word for sleep ends up being sunu. These notches on top of U's and I's will be somewhat unfamiliar to you. These mark the so-called hieras. We will get back to that in more detail later, but imagine these as being neutral vowels that are quite similar to either an U or an I. So they are situated at the top of the mouth and a little bit back or a little bit forward. And then syllable final nasal consonants merge into the vowel of the syllable. For example, here we have, again, the first example is from Balto-Slavic for meat, mensa, and this becomes meso in early Slavic. So this is a nasal vowel, much like you hear in French, for example. Eh. Part of the air leaves through the nose. As an opposite process, you do get some new syllable onsets, so beginning consonants. This process is called prothesis, and in the case of Slavic languages, lone front vowels, so in syllables that do not have an onset to begin with, they gain new semivowels as their new beginning. Here we have the Proto-Indo-European for I. Kegoch becomes Ezu in Balto-Slavic, and Jesu in early Slavic. This is actually the reason that I is Ya in modern Russian. This, if you speak, for example, Spanish, in Spanish, I is yo, and you might think that that is quite similar to ya in Russian, but historically it is not. The yo in Spanish or the io in Italian actually derive from the e and o of the original ego or ego in Latin. So the ya in Russian only preserves the e from the first syllable of the original word. Then our fun drinking game begins. This is the first round of palatalization in the Slavic languages. The first one is the so-called first regressive palatalization. From the first and regressive, you might be able to calculate that there will be another regressive palatalization as well as a non-regressive palatalization. Until now, we have run into this exact process, for example, in Latin. This is the process that turns Caesar into Caesar, and in that case we do not call it regressive, because there is not another kind present in the Romance languages. But regressive means that the vowel that causes this is in front of the consonant. So the process runs backwards. The vowel affects the consonant behind it. So here we have woman again, Gena in Balto-Slavic, goes through a couple of phases. First it becomes Jena, and then eventually it loses the alveolar stop and becomes Jena, at which point the new three intonation system appears. We don't really know. At the beginning, the Balto-Slavic languages become regularly stressed, unlike Proto-Indo-European, where any syllable might be stressed. Early Balto-Slavic becomes stressed on the first syllable, like all of the other Western Indo-European languages that we have talked about. But by the Common Slavic period, this has again become free. Then the other palatal process at this stage is iotation. Here, iota is Greek for J or I. In this case, a palatal glide, so this is a palatal semivowel or a high vowel, so y or e, palatalizes the preceding consonant and disappears in the process. So in this way it is different from the regressive palatalization. Here we have kauti, to beat in Balto-Slavic becomes kovati, and kovat in Common Slavic, to forge. So there has been a slight difference in the meaning of the word. And the change from Common Slavic to Russian is fairly small. This word is kavatye in modern Russian, as I recall. So the first syllable has, the first vowel has only become reduced in the 1,500 years that have passed. There are also some developments in the vowels of the language. One of them is vowel fronting. So vowels that come after J, Y, become front vowels. They are now pulled forward by the semivowel. So this is kind of the opposite process, or the opposite direction of the previous processes. And diphthongs, so moving from one vowel to another inside a single syllable, become monophthongs. So you only remain inside one vowel in one syllable. We go from ya-te to yet. It would have been yete in a between form here, but of course the iotation has affected this as well. This is a form that no longer survives in modern Russian, but Yehatye is derived from this and has undergone very few changes to modern Russian. And then we have another round of palatalization, still within the Slavic developmental phase. So here we have the second regressive palatalization. This is fundamentally the same process as the first one, but some time had passed between here. So there are now new words in the language that can be affected by this. Some of them are loan words, and some of them have developed as a result of, for example, the monophthongization that we just talked about. This is the case for both of these example words. We have whole, as in not separated, was kailas in Balto-Slavic, becomes kelu in very early Slavic, and kelu in Common Slavic. Another example is something that actually happens only in the South Slavic languages through nature, but became spread through all of the other ones because Old Church Slavonic, a liturgical language of the extremely early Middle Ages in the Slavic language area, was a kind of South Slavic, and it became a prestige language for all of the Slavic languages. For example, old Orthodox Bibles are all written into Old Church Slavonic, and I think it was about 1,000 years later that, for example, the Russian Church started using a Russian language Bible instead of an Old Church Slavonic Bible. This is star, originally Guaizda, becomes Guezda, and intermediately becomes Zvezda. Again, the D becomes lost in this language, and in modern Russian this is Zvezda. Then we have the opposite of a regressive, the progressive palatalization. This time it's the vowel that is in front of a consonant that triggers the palatalization. So the process proceeds from the vowel into the consonant in front of it. Here, this example is a Germanic loanword for king, kuningas. This becomes, actually here we have several examples of some of these processes. We have the nasalization, so the ng has been swallowed into the vowel. The z at the end of the word has been entirely lost. And then we have this progressive palatalization. We have ku ne gi at a certain point in time, and this becomes palatalized into ku ne ji. This is another example of where the D eventually gets lost. This word becomes knyaz in modern Russian and is used for smaller independent rulers. For example, these are often called princes in English. The Prince of Monaco, for example, would be the knyaz of Monaco in Russian. Then we come into the various branches of the Slavic languages. We have West Slavic, for example, Czech, Slovakian, and Polish are from this branch. South Slavic languages, for example, Old Church Slavonic, then Serbo-Croatian, Slovenian, Bulgarian. East Slavic, that is most important for us today, and possibly another North Slavic branch. Novgorodian was the Slavic language of the extreme north of early Russia. And judging by the way that they wrote, it seems that these last two palatalization processes might not have taken place in Novgorodian, or it might be substrate effect from the Uralic languages spoken in this area before the Slavic languages spread that far north. We don't really know. It might be that the this so-called North Slavic language area might have historically been a branch of the East Slavic languages. This is perhaps the more conventional interpretation. In any case, we know that the Novgorodian language was far more influenced by the Uralic languages than modern Russian is, and Old Novgorodian has been entirely eliminated. And although there is a northern dialect group of Russian today, it does not really share a common origin with the or an origin in the Novgorodian language. Further of interest might be the extents of these languages at this time. This would be the early Middle Ages. The Western Slavic languages have taken area or spread into areas formerly occupied by Eastern Germanic speakers. This is most likely when the Eastern Germanic languages die out in this area. Some of them survive as isolated islands, for example, in the Crimea. And the area of Slavic inhabitation even spreads to inside modern Germany along the Elbe River. And of course, Czechia, Slovakia becomes Slavic as well at this point. And most of modern Hungary becomes either West or Southern Slavic. This was before the Hungarians arrived. And we do not know which branch the local language more closely related to, as it was then assimilated by the Hungarians later. At this point in time, Ukraine and the northern Kuban region, here east of Ukraine, were still full of Aryan speakers. This was before the Turks arrived from Asia. Then moving into the Eastern Slavic languages. And this is where the so-called yeras disappear. And here we have a better or more detailed explanation of what that means. This box here is a diagram of the mouth. On the left here, the tongue is at the front. On the right, it is at the back. Then it can be high or low. So the front yer, written with in the Cyrillic alphabet with this symbol, was high and neutral, but a little bit forward, so a kind of E. And the back yer was similarly a little bit back, so instead of U, it would be U. And as in many languages that we have discussed, these kinds of neutral vowels become eliminated. In the case of the Eastern Slavic languages, there are two directions that this collapse can take. Either a yer simply disappears, or it turns into an extreme vowel. They simply disappear when they come before another vowel, excluding when that vowel is another yer. In that case, the second yer survives, even if there's a further yer or vowel after it, or when the yer is word final. In the case that the yer survives, the front yer transforms into an E, so it moves down in the mouth, but to the extreme forward, and the back yer also moves a little bit down, but to the extreme back of the mouth. From U, you get O, and from I, you get E. Here we have an example of the name of the city of Smolensk in, I think this is still in Russia, but extremely close to the Belarusian border. This was one of the earliest Slavic settlements in the further north East Slavic area. And it was originally Sumolinisku, so it had 5 syllables, all of which had a vowel in it. But 3 of these 5 vowels end up being eliminated. The first, U, disappears because it comes before an extreme vowel, O. The final one disappears because it is word final. And out of the 2 remaining, the first one survives because the next one is also a yer. If this yer was not word final, then we would expect the middle one to survive, but this is a bit of a special case. So once this process had gone through, the city or village of Sumolinisku would have been called Smolensk. This is almost the same in modern Russian. In modern Russian, the O has become a neutral vowel itself. Ironically enough, as this is actually the only vowel that was not a neutral vowel originally. The loss of the yeras is the major development of the Eastern Slavic period, and this leads to a lot of different processes that are caused by the disappearing yeras. One of these is palatalization, in which the disappearing yer palatalizes the consonant before it and leaves no other traces. Here we have darkness. Tima becomes kima. This might be a difficult sound for non-Russian speakers to make. It is certainly a bit of work for me. Then, in some cases, you get a consonant cluster where there used to be a yer. Here we have putitsa, meaning a bird, becomes kitsa in late Eastern Slavic. There can also be some merging of syllables around the lost yeras. In the case of Sunu, there are no non-yer vowels in this word. So if it wants to survive, one of these has to strengthen. In this case, it is the first one, because the second one is word final. So it becomes destroyed by default. And of course, in this case, the N does not create its own syllable, as the Slavic languages at this point did not have syllabic consonants, although some of them did develop them later, or re-develop them. So sleep in modern Russian becomes son. Fairly similar to sogno in modern Italian. Actually, as a Russian learner, I usually have to compare the Russian vocabulary to Romance vocabulary to find this kind of mental connections. They are not similar, but out of the Indo-European languages that I speak, it is the easiest connection to make. So at this point, we have reached the Russian stage. And there are now 3 major branches of the East Slavic languages. Maybe 4, if in fact Novgorodian was a kind of East Slavic that became sort of archaicized by contact with the hierarchical languages. But the 3 that survive are Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian. Belarus is White Russia in Russian, and this country and language is in fact called White Russia in a number of languages. For example, in German, Weißrussland. There used to be 3 different Russias that were differentiated by color. What we call Russia today was the, I think, the Black Russia, Черная Русь, and Ukraine was the Red Rus, if I recall correctly. Later in history, the Ukraine has been called Little Russia by Russians. Malorusky, for example, Little Russian for the Ukrainian language. This is, of course, something that you might not want to call Ukrainians today, at least not to their faces. Some Russian researchers also group Polish as a particularly divergent Eastern Slavic language, whereas most Westerners group Polish as a particularly divergent Western Slavic language. What everyone can agree to is that Polish is sort of sits between the East and Western Slavic branches, and if we wanted to split it into its own main branch, it would be a kind of a bridge between the East and West. But basically all researchers group it as a part of either East or West. So question, Muscovy, Novgorod and Ruthenia? Not quite. If we want to find a political unit, actually let's turn the map on. If we want to match these language groups to political units of the Middle Ages, the Duchy of Smolensk, so again Smolensk, would probably be the best fit for the Belarusian language. Later, in the early modern period, Belarusian was mostly spoken within the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, which, despite Lithuania being quite small physically and by population, managed to rule over large parts of the Eastern Slavic language area. Novgorod, the Republic of Novgorod, was originally, of course, Novgorodian speaking, with extremely large Uralic minorities, and later became assimilated into the Russian language, which was also spoken by the Muscovites. So really the expansion of the Grand Duchy of Moscow was the process that spread the Russian language further north and further south, and of course later into the east. For the Ukrainian language, there wasn't an actual settled Ukrainian speaking state until the very modern period. The original Cossacks were Ukrainian speaking, and you might speak of a Cossack hetmanate, but this would be more of a not really a state in the sense that we would talk about the Kingdom of France, for example, or the Grand Duchy of Moscow. This was sort of a pastoral nomadic existence. The Ukrainian language area was then divided between the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, partially, which eventually entered a union with the Kingdom of Poland. If you have heard about the Commonwealth of Poland-Lithuania, that is what we are talking about. And then later Muscovy and later the Empire of Russia spread into the Ukrainian language area. Parts of it, of course, were ruled by the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish great power, as practically all of the shores of the Black Sea were either part of or vassals of the Ottoman Empire in the early modern period. F to pay respect to the Commonwealth. I am actually going to type an F here. I'm not an expert on the history of the Commonwealth, but as I have learned it, its downfall was its political decentralization. The Commonwealth had a sort of a noble republic nature to it, that there was a parliament, there was an elected king, and these could make decisions, but any noble could veto any decision made. This was called the liberum veto, the I deny of the free in Latin, as this was a Catholic country. And of course, the nobility was about 10% of the population. Many nobles were extremely poor. And then the hostile great powers around Poland, Lithuania, such as Prussia, Austria, and Russia, were almost always able to find someone to bribe. And the last centuries of the Commonwealth were a time of stagnation, and eventually pre-partitions broke up the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth into parts of Russia, Prussia, and Austria. But moving away into the Russian language. Here we have a loss of nasal vowels, which originally, of course, came from a nasal consonant. The and used to be ranka, becomes roka, and eventually in Russian ruka. Again, the stressed syllable has changed between the Balto-Slavic and Russian development stages. There's also a loss of phonemic vowel length, so now only stressed vowels can be long. Prior to this, some vowels could just be long without being stressed. So you had a similar system to modern German, actually. In modern German, you can have a long syllable that is so for example, you can have a stressed and a non-stressed syllable, both of which are long. So for example, Wasser, water. This is the same case in English as well. But you could not have a short syllable that was stressed. This is generally not possible in languages that are stress-timed. You only find these in Mora-timed languages such as Finnish or Latin or Japanese. However, in Russian, the development became that neither of these can exist. So you can only have a long stressed syllable and a short unstressed syllable. No other possibilities. If you learn, for example, Czech, you may run into some long vowels that are not stressed. In the Western Slavic languages, this process did not happen, as of course we are by this point far into the Eastern branch. For example, all nasal vowels used to be long, so the roka would have had two long vowels, assuming that the movement of the stress happened before the loss of the nasal vowel. And another vowel development is a stressed e becomes lost. This epsilon means an e that is slightly lower in the mouth than a normal one. If you speak French or Italian, you have run into these. For example, in Italian, if you say you've done well, hai fatto bene, this is the stressed syllable is e, bene, and the second one is the normal e that we are all familiar with. This happens again in palatal contexts, but the consonants the consonant before that has to be vaguely palatal does not have to be a palatal consonant. It just has to be a consonant in which the tongue is in contact with the palate. So for example, here we have th. If you lay your tongue along the alveolar ridge and the palate, as you do, making this sound, it counts. Oh, yes, it counts, and that is why it does not. This change does not happen. The preceding consonant has to be vaguely palatal, and the consonant after has to be non-palatal. So, in the case of the second word, which would have originally been zeg, this becomes zog, as the g here is a velar consonant, so the tongue does not interact with the palate at all. So here, jets is to burn, and zog is burned, the imperfect male form of the word. You run into this, for example, in the word zionui or green. The yo here is caused by this same process. Then something typical for most Russian dialects, excluding the northern dialects, which are spoken in the same area that Novgorodian used to be spoken. So the lack of neutral vowels might actually be some kind of a survival of Novgorodian features, but we unfortunately don't know. Might be a coincidence as well. This reduction of many, but not all, unstressed vowels is extremely typical of modern Russian. There are three processes. In one case, the preceding consonant is not palatal at all, in which case a and o, which are the low and middle back vowels, become low and middle central vowels, depending on the context again. So we have milk was moloko in Old Russian, becomes mulako in modern Russian. Here, which one of these it becomes is a question of which position it takes in comparison to the stressed syllable. So in this case, in the case of o, the syllable that is immediately before the stressed syllable gets the lower variant, so a. Not like a, but a. And the syllable that is the furthest apart from the stressed syllable gets the entirely neutral one, so Then, if we have again a completely non-palatal consonant and an a or e after that, so front vowels, this becomes an e. This is quite similar to the yeras from earlier time periods. Here we have tsena for price, that you pay for something. This becomes tsina. Neutral, but still high. And the third process, which has not taken place in the southern dialects, is one where the preceding consonant is vaguely or actually palatal, and this affects the low and front vowels, so a, e. These also become a sort of neutral e, but in this case it is slightly lower and slightly further forward in the mouth. So we eat, yedim becomes yedim. And then some simplification of consonant clusters. Although Russian has a reputation as a language with an obscene amount of consonant clusters, it has actually lost some of them. So there are some other Slavic languages that are even worse in this respect. Here we have a couple of examples. When you have an alveolar consonant and a liquid, the alveolar becomes lost. So the D here is a voiced alveolar stop, and the L is a liquid. An R would also be a liquid. Mydlo, soap, becomes mylo. This mydlo survives in Polish at least. Then if you have a liquid consonant and a cluster after that, so 2 or more consonants following a liquid consonant, the liquid gets lost. Again, this is the first vowel of the cluster to disappear. The sun, solnice. No, the first syllable is stressed. Solnice becomes sonce. In this case, the palatalization becomes lost as well. This is something that is explained in the next point. However, this only disappears when you have this cluster in Old East Slavic. This would be a total of 4 consonants after one another. In the word solar, so the adjective of sun, this becomes solnetsnui, and the L survives because now there is only a single consonant after it, no cluster. And then we have the depalatalization, for once, of a non-liquid consonant, so not an L or an R, that is part of a cluster. So of course the opposite is true. Liquid palatalized consonants do not lose their palatalization. So again, solnce becomes sonce without the palatal element to the N. And even some consonant clusters are eliminated by adding a vowel in the middle. Here we have milk, for example, was melko in Old East Slavic, becomes moloko, and of course moloko in later Russian. In this case, the new vowel is the same vowel that already exists in this context. So the O from the last syllable gets added into the new middle syllable. This happens when you have a liquid and a single consonant after it. So in the first example, you have L and K, and in the second one you have R and G. Shore used to be bergu. Here we have the loss of the word final yer and the pleophony that adds the new E from the front this time. So bergu becomes berek, still meaning shore. Then finally we come into current Russian. So this is the kinds of modern developments that are generally not reflected in the orthography. Russian has had a relatively recent orthographic reform at the beginning of last century. So the written form of Russian is about 100 years old. So these developments have happened more or less in the last 100 years. Not all of them are completely through yet. So for example, the degemination is still running. You sometimes hear long consonants and sometimes less of them. This can lead into the loss of distinction between words. We have voz, meaning cart, and import. This is made from a preposition and cart, so sort of you cart in. The v actually is, if not entirely, then almost entirely analogous to in Western European languages. For example, you would say vrasi in Russia, or vrasiu into Russia. So this explains why voz, so to cart in, means import. In the case of this Latinate word here, the origin of this is to carry in. So it has a similar derivation as voz did in Russian. So the distinction in the length of the initial v is disappearing, and you may not be able to differentiate these. In modern Russian, these are likely both to be pronounced as vos, because of the next step, the devoicing of word final consonants. So consonants that come at the end of a word and are voiced, like muj, this means husband, generally are losing their voicing. I also find this the devoiced variants easier to pronounce, so I'm not surprised that this process is happening. So this ends up with husband being spelled muj, but being pronounced as smoosh. And in the same way, cat is still spelled voz, but generally will be pronounced vos. Then we have some regressive assimilation of the special characteristics of the Russian language, the voicing and palatalization, which are both extremely common in the language. So the regressive again here means that the process runs from the end towards the beginning. So if you have a consonant cluster, you look at the final consonant in it and you take the voicing, either voiced or non-voiced, and the palatalization, either palatal or non-palatal, and you apply that to all of the consonants in the cluster. This also works across a syllable break, as we see in this first example. We have vodka, meaning kind of little water, and of course this is an alcoholic drink, as I have been told, developed from grappa that Italian workers for Peter the Great attempted to make in Russia while working as foreign experts there. And this becomes vodka. So just don't bother voicing the D, and you'll sound more like a native speaker. Then we have the word star, once again, zvizda. Here the Z was originally not palatalized, but because the V is palatalized, this spreads into the Z as well. Zvizda. This is a development that I honestly find more difficult, as my native language has no clusters with several palatalized consonants in them. How pronouncing all these words as they are written makes you sound as a foreigner, I unfortunately can't tell you. I don't know. You might be seen as a foreigner. You might be seen as a kind of Juni, deliberately speaking in an antiquated fashion. Who knows? In any case, with this, the main presentation comes to an end. Thank you to everyone for watching. La missa è finita. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk, and goodbye to those watching on YouTube afterwards.